All right, here we are, American History Hybrid students, the last week for trimester 2. This week, we're taking a look at the New Deal and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. By the end of these notes, you should be able to answer the following learning objectives. 1. Summarize the initial steps FDR took to reform banking and finance. 2. Describe the New Deal work programs. 3. Identify critics of FDR's New Deal. 4. Describe the purpose of the second New Deal. That's right, he had two New Deals, and they both happened within the first 100 days of his first term and second term as president. 5. Identify the second national deal programs aimed at assisting young people and professionals. 6. Summarize labor and economic reforms carried out under the second New Deal. 7. Describe how the New Deal affected women and African Americans. 8. Describe the supporters of FDR's New Deal. 9. Describe some of the role media played during the New Deal era. And lastly, summarize the opinions of the effectiveness of the New Deal and its legacy. All right, the New Deal fights. Americans get a New Deal. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt represented the Democratic Party. He was known by his popular name of FDR. He was a two-term governor of New York and a distant cousin of former President Theodore Roosevelt. He was a reform-minded individual, working hard to combat the problems of unemployment and poverty. Unlike Hoover, Roosevelt possessed a can-do attitude and projected an air of friendliness and a confidence that attracted many voters. So in 1932, he won the general election. However, he had to wait 4 months before he could take office. So again, he was nominated and elected in November, but wasn't inaugurated as president until March of 1933, thus creating the 20th Amendment, which moved presidential inauguration, decreasing the lame duck period of a president, as you can in other words, when a president's elected in November with the 20th Amendment, they will now be inaugurated no later than February of, in that case, 1933. But that didn't apply to the 1932 election. Okay, a New Deal. The New Deal was a phrase given to the campaign of FDR. Basically, he's providing a New Deal for all American people. This New Deal really focused on three goals: relief, recovery, and reform. The three R's. Again, the relief, recovery, and reform. So in the first 100 days of office, he begins to make change. In fact, in day 1 of taking office, he declares a bank holiday, and he mandates that all banks close to prevent further withdrawals during the Great Depression. He then persuaded Congress to pass the Emergency Banking Relief Act. The Emergency Banking Relief Act authorized the Treasury Department to inspect the country's banks. Those that were sound could reopen at once. Those that were insolvent, unable to pay their debts, would remain closed. And also, he was known for his fireside chats. Fireside chats were his public forum where he'd do radio talks on public concerns, explaining in very clear, simple language his New Deal measures, thus really encouraging Americans in understanding exactly what his initiatives were because of his charismatic, friendly, and very open way of communicating. Helped convince them that the New Deal was the right way to incur public, or the right way to help the public with government regulation. Regulating banking and financing, he passes the Glass-Steagall Act in 1933. This creates the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, in other words, the acronym FDIC. The FDIC provided federal insurance to individuals' bank accounts up to $5,000. The FDIC still exists today, and if I recall correctly, anybody that has savings up to $100,000 is protected under the FDIC. He also creates the Federal Securities Act. The Federal Security Act was passed in 1933 and required corporations to provide complete information on all stock offerings, thus ending speculation. And he made these stock offerings liable for any misinterpretations. These would be scrutinized by the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission. They would regulate the stock market. The SEC today still plays a major factor in regulating the stock market. The 21st Amendment, again, that is going to repeal the Prohibition Amendment, thus making the sale and manufacture of alcohol legal once again. And that will be passed in 1933, ending Prohibition. Helping the American people. He provides rural assistance with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, also known as the acronym AAA. Again, when you look at FDR as a president, he will pass more acts than any other president before him. So bear with me as I go through all the acts that he does pass, and some of them will be on the test. The AAA raised crop prices by lowering production. He also creates the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is known as the TVA. That was established in 1933. The TVA was excavating the Tennessee River Valley, renovated 5 existing dams, and constructed 20 new ones, creating thousands of jobs, provided food or flood control, hydroelectric power, and other benefits to the impoverished region of the South. He also created the Civilian Corps, or the CCC. This will put young men ages 18 to 25 back to work. They will work on roads, they'll develop parks, they'll plant trees, they'll help in soil erosion and other flood control projects. Almost 3 million young men had passed through the CCC from its onset of 1933 till the end of it in 1942. The National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, will be passed as well. This provided money to states, which states would then use to construct schools. They would build community buildings. They also, under the NIRA, established the Civil Works Administration. The Civil Works Administration provided 4 million immediate jobs during the winter months of 1933 to 1934. This would pay for the salaries of teachers. Nearly 50,000 teachers in America's rural areas were supported under this act. They built more than 500,000 miles of road, also under this act. Promoting fair business. When we look at fair business practices, we first take a look at the National Recovery Administration. Again, this will put forth the rights of laborers. It'll establish the unionization again, where they will compete for a fair, where they will bargain under collective bargaining for fair work practices and working rights. We'll also see the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which was funded with about $500 million to provide direct relief to the needy. Half of the money was given to the states as direct grants to help furnish food and clothing to the unemployed, the aged, and the ill. The rest was distributed to states to support work relief programs. New Deals come under attack. Many people argue that Roosevelt is deficit spending, in other words, spending money the government does not have. Critics argued that Roosevelt spent too much on direct relief and used the New Deal policies to control businesses and to socialize the economy. Some critics even said that he interfered with the free market economy, disrupting the way that fair trade should be regulated or should not be regulated by the government. The Supreme Court reacts to some of his early first New Deals. They strike down the NIR. Again, the NIR is going to be proved to be unconstitutional. It declared that the law gave legislative powers to the executive branch and that the enforcement of industrial codes within states went beyond the federal government's constitutional powers. They also struck down the AAA. Again, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was struck down by the Supreme Court justices because agriculture should be a local matter, not a federal matter. However, the Supreme Court justices do shift. We start to see it in 1937 when FDR appoints his first Supreme Court Justice, Hugo S. Black, which shifts the balance of the Supreme Court. Throughout the next 4 years of his presidency, he will appoint over 7 new justices. And so, again, when we look at the Supreme Court Justice, whose main job is to interpret and rule laws, constitutional and unconstitutional, will now be in the favor of FDR, and we'll really see a passage of his new acts under his second New Deal era. In response, conservatives will form the American Liberty League. The American Liberty League opposed New Deal measures and believed it violated the respects for rights of individuals and properties. Roosevelt's Second New Deal. Again, this New Deal will take place in the first 100 days, and his focus is to build on programs from the first New Deal. Again, the work programs in producing still raising unemployment wages. The Second New Deal, or the second 100 days, really focused on farmers and workers. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, had traveled the country, and through her traveling the country, for the first time, a president's wife observed the social conditions and the harsh conditions and the suffering the nation's people were under, and she really urges her husband to make change. One of the ways he makes changes that during his first New Deal, the Supreme Court justice struck down the AAR. Then he replaces it with the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act. This act paid farmers for cutting production of soil-depleting crops and rewarded farmers for practicing good soil conservation methods. Then later, the Soil Conservation Domestic Allotment Act will later turn into the Second Agricultural Adjustment Act, which is approved in 1938. Improving labor. When we talk about improving labor, the passage of the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act reestablished the NIR, which again provided laborers with the ability to collective bargain. We also see in 1938 the Federal Labor Standards Act is passed, and this is to set a minimum work week to 44 hours, decreasing it to 40 hours after 2 years, and setting a minimum wage at 25 cents an hour, and then by 1945, 40 cents. And this would be granted to all workers above the age of 16. He establishes the Social Security Act in 1935. Social Security Act has three primary beneficiaries. The first is the unemployment, those or the unemployed, or those that need compensation packages. The unemployment would be given to the state, where the state would then dole it out to the recipients. It also applies to the retirees, where I'm not sure where that one disappeared to, but the retirees, anybody over the age of 65 and their spouses was eligible for retirement plan packages. And we also see it helps the disabled, and we also see it helps the families specifically poor families with dependent children. Again, this is government assistance. He also regulates the utilities, promoting rural electrification by decreasing the price of utilities for rural farmers and rural homes. By 1949, 90% of all rural homes had electricity. All in all, again, he'll regulate utilities. All in all, the New Deal struggled to help farmers and other workers overcome the Great Depression. It assisted many different groups in the nation, including women, African American, and Native Americans. The New Deal, how they affect different groups. The New Deal brings opportunity. When we look at women, several women were granted government positions. The most notable, Frances Perkins, became the first American female cabinet member. During this time, though, the public opinion taken by the Gallup poll indicated that the majority, 82% of Americans, said that women should not work if the husband has a job. We see many of these acts, however, did have a gender bias. Many of the acts were geared just towards men. We see African Americans appointed to government positions. We'll see Roosevelt will appoint over 100 African Americans to key positions. During this time, Mary McLeod Bethune, an educator who dedicated herself to promoting opportunities for young African Americans, dubbed the FDR's appointment of 100 African Americans to key positions as the Black Cabinet. However, FDR never supported civil rights movements. In other words, he refused to approve federal anti-lynching laws, to end poll taxes, and to end discriminatory measures against African Americans. Mexican Americans received fewer rights than that of African Americans. Many of the Mexican Americans resided in the Southwest, Most found migrant labor on farms. Um, Farm wages fell, so did the migrant wage, and none of the acts. Well, indirectly, the CCC and the WPA helped some Mexican Americans, but these agencies also discriminated against them. Native Americans do gain support. John Collier, a commissioner of the Indian Affairs, Collier helped create the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which its main theme was to move away from assimilation, and now Native Americans can pursue autonomy. It also helped create and restore some reservation lands to tribal ownership. The act made changes in three areas. Economic, Native American lands would belong to an entire tribe. This provision strengthened Native American land claims. And the second area was cultural, that Native Americans could form their own schools and attend schools on reservations. And the third area of this reform was political, where tribes could elect tribal councils to govern their reservations. FDR creates a new coalition, which is an alignment of diverse groups dedicated to supporting the Democratic Party. The coalition included many people: Southern whites, various urban groups, African Americans, and unionized industrial workers. Also urbanites, or urbanized dwellers. Labor disputes take place in the 1930s. Unions grow between 1933 and 1941 from 3 million to over 10 million people. Labor disputes are often handled with sit-down strikes. Instead of walking off the jobs, workers would remain inside the plants, but they did not work, which prevented the factory from carrying out production and importing scabs or replacement workers. Urban voters also helped FDR win the election in 1936. President Roosevelt carried the majority of the vote in the nation's 12 largest cities. During this time also, he appointed many officials of urban immigrant backgrounds, particularly Roman Catholics and Jews, to important government positions. All right, culture in the 1930s. The lure of motion pictures and radios. When we look at motion pictures, in the 1930s, nearly 65% of the population attended movies at least once a week. Meanwhile, by 1940, 90% of all households had radios. Some notable movies. The first listed there is Gone with the Wind. You can see pictured in the upper right. Starred Clark Gable, Marlene Dietrich, and James Gagne. Again, the popularity of Hollywoods will form as the center of film industry during this time. The Gone with the Wind is centered on wealth, romance, and good times. We see other romantic comedies with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers in the film Flying Down the Rio. We see comedies such as Monkey Business and Duck Soup, which are both created in 1931, starring the zany Marx Brothers. We see Orson Welles and his entertainment on the radios. Orson Welles was an actor, director, producer, and writer. Created one of the most renowned radio broadcasts of all time, The War of the Worlds. And then later he created Citizen Kane. Bob Hope and Jeannie Benny were comedians, starred on radio first, then later in motion pictures. The arts centered around a sober and serious feel to them, both art, music, and literature alike. The Federal Art Project is passed, which is a branch of the WPA, which paid artists a living wage to produce public art. It also aimed to increase public appreciation of art and to promote positive images of American society. Grant Wood, who's going to be a painter during this time, he'll create the famous painting, The American Gothic, which is pictured here to the right. The American Gothic, again, we see the harsh, grim reality of the agrarian society during the Great Depression. John Steinbeck's going to write about it. First, before I get to John Steinbeck, Woody Guthrie. Woody Guthrie used music to capture the hardships of America. John Steinbeck will write a book that you very well might be reading. or have read The Grapes of Wrath, which reveals the lives of Oklahomans who left the Dust Bowl and ended up in California. The impact of the New Deal. The New Deal reforms endure. FDR was extremely popular amongst the working class Americans throughout his 2 terms. However, when we look at the true numbers, some would argue that his acts didn't really help the targeted issues that he tried to solve during both of his first 2 New Deals. When we look at 1937, 7.7 million people were unemployed. A year later, 10.4 million people were unemployed. By 1939, historians claim that the New Deals were effectively over. The lasting impressions that they did have, clearly the expanded role of government or government regulation. We see government regulation, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, again backing individuals' monies that are put into banks. We also see the SEC, or the Security and Exchange Commission, which regulated stock markets and investments in the stock market. The New Deal didn't really end the Great Depression. It did help reduce the suffering. What really it did is it boosted the morale of the American society. And really what will end the Great Depression will be the spending by the federal government for World War II on guns, tanks, ships, and airplanes, which during the war they'll generate over $54.5 billion by 1943, thus really ending the Great Depression. Social and environmental effects. Social effects we see with the Second Agricultural Act, or the Second Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was passed in 1938. Loans were made to farmers. Again, the value of the loans was determined based on the amount of farmers' surplus crops and the parity price. The parity price is a price intended to keep farmers' income steady. And they also established agricultural price standards that even affect farming today. We also see rural electrification, helped to improve the conditions of rural America. The environment, we see conservation efforts. One of them we see is the Civilian Conservation Corps, which planted trees, created hiking trails, and built fire lookout towers. The Soil Conservation Service taught farmers how to conserve soil through plowing techniques, terracing techniques, and crop rotation techniques. And the second would be the Tennessee Valley Authority, which again taught the poor southern region of Tennessee how to harness water power to generate electricity, hydroelectric power, and control floods, disastrous floods, as we see here in the picture, really helping not only Tennessee but parts of Alabama and North Carolina, as well as Virginia. This is the end of Trimester 2's notes. Again, as always, please review the learning outcomes and begin Week 11's activity. And also, as I've encouraged you in class last week, make sure that you're working on the Trimester 2 test review. Please see me if you have any questions.